The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. My heart raced as I stared at the cracked screen. Jack's message still glowing. "Babe, my parents want to meet you. Dinner at their place tomorrow night." I'd been waiting for this moment for months, but now that it was here, dread washed over me. Jack and I had been dating for 2 years, and he'd always found excuses to keep me away from his family. "What changed? Emma? You okay in there?" My dad's voice called from the living room. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Yeah, Dad. Just dropped my phone." I stepped out of my bedroom, forcing a smile. Dad sat in his favorite armchair, newspaper in hand. He peered at me over his reading glasses, concern etched on his face. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I sank onto the couch, twisting my hands in my lap. "Jack's parents want to meet me." Dad's eyebrows shot up. "Well, it's about time." "What's got you looking like you've seen a ghost?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Jack's always been so evasive about his family. And now, out of the blue, they want to meet?" Dad folded his newspaper, giving me his full attention. "Emma, you're a smart, successful woman. If they can't see that, it's their loss." I nodded, grateful for his support. But a nagging voice in my head whispered that there was more to this sudden invitation than met the eye. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Jack. "Wear something nice. They're particular about appearances." I frowned, a chill running down my spine. What was I walking into? "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I have a bad feeling about this." I smoothed down my dress for the 100th time, my stomach in knots as Jack and I approached his parents' mansion. The sprawling estate made me feel small, insignificant. "Ready?" Jack squeezed my hand, flashing that smile that usually melted my heart. Tonight it barely eased my nerves. Before we could knock, the door swung open. A statuesque woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair stood there, her eyes sharp as they raked over me. "Jack, darling," she cooed, embracing him. Then her gaze landed on me. "And you must be Emma." "It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Brennan," I said, extending my hand. She ignored it, turning on her heel. "Come in, dinner's getting cold." Jack's father, Frank, was waiting in the dining room. He gave Jack a firm handshake before turning to me with a critical eye. "So, Emma?" Frank's voice was gruff. "Jack tells us you work in marketing, for a small firm, isn't it?" I felt my cheeks flush. "It's a growing company with a lot of potential." Paula's laugh was like tinkling glass. "Oh, darling, potential doesn't pay the bills, does it?" The rest of dinner passed in a blur of thinly veiled insults and probing questions about my background. Jack remained silent, occasionally shooting me apologetic glances. As we left, Paula pulled Jack aside. I couldn't hear what she said, but his face paled. In the car, I turned to Jack. "What did your mother say?" He hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "Emma, I was going to wait, but..." My breath caught as he pulled out a velvet box. Inside was a diamond ring that could have paid my rent for a year. "Will you marry me?" Jack asked, his eyes pleading. I stared at the ring, my mind reeling. This was everything I dreamed of, but why did it feel so wrong? The engagement ring felt heavy on my finger as Jack and I walked into his parents' country club. It was supposed to be a celebration, but my stomach churned with dread. Paula's eyes zeroed in on the ring immediately. "Oh, darling, it looks even lovelier on you than I imagined." I froze. "You picked out my engagement ring?" Jack squeezed my hand, a warning. "Mom helped me choose it, that's all." Frank clapped Jack on the back. "Now let's discuss the prenup, shall we?" My head snapped up. "Prenup?" Paula laughed, a brittle sound. "Of course, dear. You didn't think we'd let Jack marry without protecting the family assets, did you?" I looked at Jack, hoping to see shock or disagreement. Instead, he avoided my gaze. "I think that's a conversation for another time," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Frank's eyes narrowed. "Nonsense. No time like the present. We have some concerns about your financial situation." "My financial situation?" I echoed, disbelief coloring my words. Paula nodded, her smile sharp. "We've taken the liberty of looking into your background. Your father's business is quaint, but hardly what we're accustomed to." I felt like I'd been slapped. "You investigated me?" Jack finally spoke up. "Emma, they're just looking out for me, for us." I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "I need some air." As I rushed out, I heard Paula's voice behind me. "Jack, darling, perhaps it's time to reconsider. There are plenty of suitable girls from good families." I leaned against the wall outside, fighting back tears. This wasn't the future I'd imagined. The ring on my finger no longer felt like a promise of love, but a shackle of expectations I wasn't sure I could meet. My phone buzzed. A text from Dad. "How's the celebration going, sweetheart?" I stared at the screen, a lump in my throat. How could I tell him that the man I loved came with a family that saw me as nothing more than a liability? I paced our apartment, my engagement ring feeling like a lead weight on my finger. Jack was due home any minute, and I'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times in my head. The door opened, and Jack walked in, his smile fading as he saw my face. "Emma? What's wrong?" "We need to talk about your parents," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He sighed, loosening his tie. "They're just old-fashioned, that's all. They'll come around." Old-fashioned? I felt my temper flare. "Jack, they investigated my family. They're demanding a prenup. They treat me like I'm not good enough." "They're just protective," he argued weakly. "It's how they show they care." I stared at him, disbelief washing over me. "Is that what you really think? Or is it what they've told you to think?" Jack's face hardened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm starting to wonder if you can think for yourself at all." The words burst out before I could stop them. Silence fell between us, heavy and oppressive. "I love you, Emma," Jack said finally, his voice soft. "Isn't that enough?" I felt tears prick my eyes. I thought it was, but now I'm not so sure. Jack's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face paling. "What is it?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. He hesitated, then handed me the phone. It was an email from his mother detailing a list of suggestions for our wedding. At the bottom, a chilling line. "Remember, darling, the trust fund is contingent on our approval of the bride." I looked up at Jack, my world crumbling. "Did you know about this?" His silence was all the answer I needed. "I can't do this," I whispered, slipping the ring off my finger. "I won't be bought and sold like some commodity." As I placed the ring on the coffee table, I realized I was facing the hardest decision of my life. Stay and fight for a love that might not be strong enough, or walk away with my self-respect intact. The wedding march echoed through the church, but it felt more like a funeral dirge to me. I clutched my bouquet, my knuckles white as I took my first step down the aisle. Dad squeezed my arm, sensing my tension. "You okay, sweetheart?" he whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. How could I tell him that every step felt like a mistake? Jack stood at the altar, beaming. But as I approached, I saw Paula and Frank in the front row, their smiles sharp and predatory. Paula's eyes raked over me, her lips pursing in disapproval at my simple gown, not the extravagant one she'd tried to force on me. The ceremony passed in a blur. Before I knew it, we were at the reception, and I was trapped in a whirlwind of congratulations and fake smiles. Then came the speeches. Frank stood, champagne flute in hand, his voice booming across the room. "To Jack and Emma," he began, his tone jovial but his eyes cold. "May their union bring honor to the Brennan name and expand our family's influence. Emma, we expect great things from you, starting with quitting that little job of yours to focus on more appropriate pursuits for a Brennan wife." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. I felt the blood drain from my face. Jack leaned over, whispering urgently, "He doesn't mean it like that. Just smile, okay?" But I couldn't smile. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't a marriage. It was a business transaction, and I was the commodity being traded. Paula's voice cut through my thoughts. "And of course we're looking forward to grandchildren soon. The Brennan line must continue, after all." That was the final straw. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. All eyes turned to me. In that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. Stay and lose myself, or leave and save my soul. The diamond on my finger felt heavier than ever as I looked out at the sea of expectant faces. What would I choose? A life of luxury and suffocation, or freedom and self-respect? The reception hall fell silent as I stood, all eyes on me. My heart pounded, but before I could speak, my father's voice cut through the tension. "I think that's quite enough," Dad said, rising to his feet. His eyes, usually kind, blazed with a fury I'd never seen before. Frank scoffed. "George, this is a family matter. Your daughter—" "My daughter," Dad interrupted, "is worth 10 of you, Frank, and it's time you knew who you're dealing with." He turned to the crowd, his voice strong and clear. "For those who don't know me, I'm George Hamilton, and I've recently partnered with James Rothschild on a new venture." Gasps echoed through the room. The Rothschild name carried weight. even in the Brennan circles. Paula's face paled. You're bluffing. Dad pulled out his phone, dialing a number. James, sorry to bother you, but could you say hello to some friends of mine? He put the phone on speaker, and James Rothschild's distinctive voice filled the room, greeting everyone warmly. As Dad ended the call, I saw Jack's parents exchange panicked glances. Their carefully constructed world was crumbling. I looked at Jack, hoping to see him stand up for us, but he just sat there, eyes downcast, silent. In that moment, everything became crystal clear. This wasn't about money or status. It was about respect, about being valued for who I was, not what I could bring to a family's legacy. I slipped off my wedding ring, the diamond catching the light as I placed it on the table. I'm sorry, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, but I can't do this. Chaos erupted. Paula shrieked, Frank bellowed, and Jack just stared at me, his face a mask of shock and confusion. As I turned to leave, Dad by my side, I felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. I was walking away from everything I thought I wanted into an uncertain future. But for the first time in months, I could breathe. The reception hall erupted into chaos as I stood there, my wedding ring on the table, my decision made. Paula's shrill voice cut through the commotion. Jack! Do something! She screeched. I turned to Jack, hoping against hope that he'd finally stand up to his parents. But he just sat there, pale and silent, his eyes darting between me and his mother. Emma, please, he finally whispered. We can work this out. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. No, Jack, we can't. Not anymore. Frank lunged forward, his face red with rage. You ungrateful little gold digger, after everything we've done for you. Dad stepped between us, his voice low and dangerous. That's enough, Frank. You've said quite enough. Guests were whispering, some leaving, others watching the drama unfold with morbid fascination. I felt like I was in the eye of a storm, everything swirling around me. Suddenly, Jack stood up. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Was he finally going to defend me? Emma, he said, his voice shaking. If you walk out that door, it's over. My parents, the trust fund, I can't give that up. Please don't make me choose. And there it was, the final blow. I stared at him, the man I thought I loved, and saw a stranger. You've already chosen, Jack, I said softly. You always have. I turned to leave, my head held high, despite the tears streaming down my face. As I reached the door, Paula's voice rang out one last time. You'll regret this, Emma Hamilton. You're nothing without us. I paused, my hand on the doorknob. Every eye in the room was on me. This was it, the moment that would define the rest of my life. I took a deep breath and turned back to face the room. No, Mrs. Brennan, I'm everything without you. With those words, I pushed open the door and stepped out into the sunlight, leaving behind the life I thought I wanted, and walking towards a future that was terrifyingly uncertain, but undeniably mine. 6 months after walking out of my own wedding, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my blazer. My first day as vice president of marketing at Hamilton Enterprises had arrived. The phone rang. Dad's ringtone. Ready for your big day, sweetheart? I smiled. More than ready, Dad. Thanks for everything. As I hung up, my eyes fell on the newspaper on my desk. The headline screamed, Brennan Empire crumbles, fraud allegations surface. I felt a twinge of sadness for Jack, but no regret. The elevator dinged as I reached the office floor. Heads turned, whispers followed. I knew what they were saying, the runaway bride, the woman who dared to say no to the Brennans. I walked into the conference room, chin high. The board members were already seated, including James Rothschild himself. Miss Hamilton, James said, smiling warmly, we're excited to hear your ideas for expanding our reach. I took a deep breath and began my presentation. With each slide, each point I made, I felt stronger. This was where I belonged, not suffocating under someone else's expectations, but soaring on my own merits. As I concluded, applause filled the room. James stood, extending his hand. Impressive, Emma. Your father was right about you. Pride swelled in my chest, not because a powerful man approved, but because I had proven myself to myself. Later, as I packed up my things, a familiar figure appeared in my doorway. Jack, Emma, he said softly. I'm sorry for everything. I looked at him, this man I once thought I couldn't live without. I hope you find your way, Jack. I really do. He nodded, understanding the finality in my voice, and left. I turned to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. It was beautiful, full of promise, just like my future. I smiled, picked up my briefcase, and walked out of my office, not as someone's fiancé or daughter, but as Emma Hamilton, a woman who had found her own path. The world was waiting, and I was ready to meet it on my own terms.